Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. The Galactic Council's decision came like a blade through silk, silent, decisive, and irreversible. Humanity was to be extinguished. No parley, no ultimatums, no grand speeches before the fall. Just a single chilling decree issued from the Council's high chamber. Exterminate the species before they become a greater threat. And so, the fleet moved. 100 ships, each a fortress of steel and energy, slid through the fabric of space toward Sol. They carried weapons capable of turning entire continents into dust, soldiers bred for efficiency, and commanders who had reduced conquest to an art. To them, Earth was not a war zone, it was an afterthought. A single campaign, brief and absolute, to erase a civilization before it could become a problem. For centuries, humanity had remained a curiosity, primitive, reckless, yet undeniably persistent. They expanded, built, and destroyed in equal measure, a species driven by both brilliance and self-destruction. The Council had watched them from a distance, first with amusement, then with concern, and now, with something dangerously close to fear. Because something had changed. Humanity had crossed a line. It was not their weapons, though their crude engines of war had become disturbingly effective. It was not their expansion, though they had begun settling beyond their home system, claiming asteroids and moons, as if they had the right. No, the final straw had been something far worse. They had begun to understand. The Council's intelligence operatives had intercepted transmissions, equations scribbled in human tongues, theorems that danced too close to the forbidden. Quantum mechanics, hyperspatial physics, energy manipulation on a scale no young species should have grasped. The humans had not simply stumbled toward the truth. They had run toward it. And that was unacceptable. The Council had seen this pattern before. The rise of a species, the arrogance that followed, the inevitable war that tore through the stars. They would not allow it to happen again. Humanity would not become another unchecked power, another rival to be contained. They would be purged. The fleet surged forward, sleek and vast, an armada forged by 1,000 worlds. Their mission was not conquest, not diplomacy. It was eradication. The humans would never even have the chance to scream before they were swept from existence. But there was one thing the Council had failed to consider. Humans were never predictable. On Earth, the night sky remained undisturbed, the stars unblinking, unaware. To the billions below, life continued as if nothing loomed beyond the void. Cities pulsed with light, oceans whispered against silent shores, and the air was thick with the sounds of an indifferent world. But beneath the surface, in chambers built to withstand Armageddon, men and women worked in quiet frenzy. Screens bathed them in cold blue light, displaying calculations that dictated survival or extinction. The atmosphere was tense but not panicked. No alarms rang, no desperate cries filled the air. Humanity had seen its end foretold too many times before. This time, they had decided not to wait for it. At the heart of the chaos stood Admiral Elias Corvin, 48 years old. Formerly a scholar of cosmic navigation, now the architect of Earth's final gamble. His uniform was crisp, unadorned by the vanity of metals, as if he had no time for the past, only for what lay ahead. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, flicked across the screens before him, analyzing the trajectory of the incoming fleet. He had known they would come. The Council had made their disdain clear years ago, watching from their ivory towers as humanity clawed its way into the stars. Primitive, reckless, dangerous. Those were the words they had used. Now, humanity was about to redefine dangerous. "They're minutes away from hyperexit," a voice reported. Dr. Arya Knox, lead physicist. A mind so brilliant it could have built civilizations, but instead, it had been forced to learn how to destroy them. She stood beside Corvin, her dark eyes flicking between him and the screens, her expression unreadable. "Confirm energy grid status," Corvin ordered, voice calm, deliberate. "All systems primed. The array is charged." A slight hesitation. "This is our only shot, Admiral. If it fails..." "It won't." He had to believe that. Across the chamber, technicians exchanged glances. They had run simulations. Hundreds. Thousands. The outcome remained the same. If even a single warship from the Council's fleet broke through, Earth would not last the hour. Their defenses were a joke compared to the onslaught approaching them. Every missile, every railgun, every last piece of human-engineered weaponry would amount to nothing against the Council's arsenal. That was why Corvin had abandoned convention. That was why, in the span of 2 years, humanity had built something so absurd, so reckless, that no species before them had dared to try it. Not a weapon. A trap. The enemy would not even realize they had lost until it was already over. The Galactic Council's fleet emerged from hypertravel precisely at the predicted coordinates. 100 ships, vast and unshakable, materialized in the void, their hulls gleaming with the light of distant stars. The command vessel, Vigilance, took point. Grand Marshal Ithos Vel of the Zalrai Dominion stood at the helm, his mandibles twitching in mild amusement. This would be over quickly. Then, something changed. For a fraction of a second, the ship's energy readings surged beyond safe thresholds. No alarms blared. No explosions erupted. It was subtle, so subtle that even the most seasoned engineers aboard the fleet barely had time to register the anomaly. A whisper of something wrong. A fleeting glitch in their systems. Then came the silence. Communications dropped. Power levels plummeted. Engines failed. Vigilance went dark. One by one, every ship followed. The fleet, once a beacon of galactic dominance, hung in the void like corpses in a frozen sea. On Earth, Corvin exhaled. It worked, Arya murmured, almost in disbelief. Of course it had. The quantum disruptor array had been theorized for decades but dismissed as impossible. The concept was simple. Disrupt the very field that allowed ships to transition from hypertravel into real space. A perfectly timed, perfectly calibrated energy pulse. One that collapsed every ship's core systems the instant they materialized. A strike before a battle could even begin. No grand war. No burning cities. No heroes or martyrs. The greatest fleet in the galaxy had been rendered powerless in seconds. Earth had won. And the Council, for the first time in its long, arrogant history, would have no choice but to acknowledge what they had feared all along. Humanity was not reckless. It was not primitive. It was inevitable. In the cold void above Earth, the greatest fleet the Galactic Council had ever assembled hung lifeless. No wreckage, no fire, no explosion. Just silence. Their engines lay dormant, their weapons useless, their commanders trapped inside metal tombs adrift in the abyss. For all their arrogance, for all their might, they had never expected defeat before engagement. Admiral Elias Corvin watched the tactical display, his fingers pressed together, his mind quiet. The bridge around him murmured with activity. Technicians fine-tuning scans, analysts poring over telemetry, officers trading whispers of disbelief. But Corvin remained still. He had anticipated success, yet victory always came with questions. The quantum disruptor array had worked flawlessly, perhaps too flawlessly. He turned to Dr. Arya Knox, who stood at his side, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the silent armada above. "What's your read?" She exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's holding. No residual power signatures. No emergency systems kicking in. If I had to guess, I'd say they're blind, deaf, and paralyzed." "Yet alive," Corvin said. Arya's brow creased slightly, as if only now considering the weight of those words. "Yes, every one of them. Hundreds of ships. Tens of thousands of soldiers. Officers. Technicians. All stranded in the vast, uncaring dark, fully conscious yet incapable of action. Their life support systems would hold for months, maybe years, but they would never move again. A war had been reduced to a drifting graveyard. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting, expecting a decision. What now? Destroy them? Let them rot? Or something else entirely? The thought unsettled him. They had been prepared to fight, to burn, to survive at any cost. But this was something different. One of his officers, Commander Dallin Voss, broke the silence. "Sir, Council communications are flooding every channel. Some demanding answers. Some," he hesitated, "some begging for negotiations." Corvin narrowed his eyes. Negotiations. A day ago, The council wouldn't have spared them a second thought. Humanity was beneath them. A primitive species barely worthy of recognition. But now, with their fleet a floating relic of its former power, they suddenly wished to talk. Convenient. He nodded at Voss. Ignore the demands. Log the requests. Let them sweat. Voss hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. He had been a soldier long enough to understand leverage. Arya turned back to the display. So what's next? The question sat heavy in the air. Corvin had spent years preparing for this moment, but now that it had arrived, the path forward was not so clear. His instincts told him that the war wasn't over. Not truly. The council was many things, but above all, it was prideful. They wouldn't let this humiliation stand. Not indefinitely. Which meant humanity had bought time, but nothing more. And that time had to be used wisely. Corvin turned away from the display, his boots striking against the steel floor as he stepped toward the exit. Get me a channel with the council, he ordered. On our terms. Voss blinked. Sir, I thought we were ignoring them? Corvin glanced over his shoulder. We are. Until they're desperate enough to listen. Then he was gone. High above Earth, aboard the flagship Vigilance, Grand Marshal Ithos Vel sat in the darkness of his powerless warship, his breathing slow, measured. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. He had stood at the head of dozens of planetary campaigns. He had reduced civilizations to ash, watched entire species beg for mercy before he silenced them forever. He had been prepared for resistance, even the possibility of a long, drawn-out war. But this was insulting. Trapped in the hollowed shell of his warship, Vel flexed his claws against the metal of his chair, a slow, deliberate motion meant to keep his temper in check. He could hear the officers around him, their panic kept barely contained beneath layers of training and discipline. Even now, even here, they looked to him for answers. And he had none. Their engines were frozen, their weapons inert, their communications completely severed. The energy disruption had fried every backup system, every redundant failsafe. It was as if the very laws of physics had been rewritten to deny them function. Vel's mandibles clicked together as his second-in-command, Commander Ithar, stepped forward. Even in the dim emergency lighting, Vel could see the unease in his lieutenant's posture. This is a weapon unlike any we have encountered before, Ithar said carefully. A violation of every law we understand. Vel said nothing. He didn't need Ithar to state the obvious. But then the commander added, perhaps we have misjudged them. A low growl rumbled from Vel's chest. You mean to surrender? Ithar stiffened. No, Grand Marshal. But perhaps we should rethink our course of action. This species has accomplished something that defies expectation. Defies dominance, Vel thought bitterly. He rose from his chair, his form towering over the others in the dim light. Humanity is an aberration. It is not strength that has brought them here, it is luck. And luck is fleeting. Ithar didn't look convinced, but he bowed his head nonetheless. What is your command? Vel turned his gaze toward the viewport. Beyond the glass, the distant glow of Earth shone like a taunt. Unscarred. Undefeated. For now. His claws scraped against the metal railing. We wait, he growled. And when the time comes, we remind them why the stars belong to the strong. On Earth, in a hidden command bunker beneath the Pacific Ocean, Admiral Corvin watched the silent fleet above and knew, with absolute certainty, that the war was not over. Humanity had won this battle, but victory had a price. And the price of victory was always the next war. The war room remained tense, a space filled with quiet calculations and unspoken fears. The greatest fleet the Galactic Council had ever assembled hung lifeless in orbit, their lights dark, their weapons frozen in time. No wreckage, no fire, only a silence that stretched across the vast emptiness of space. It should have felt like victory. And yet, no one felt at ease. Admiral Elias Corvin stood at the center of it all, a motionless figure amidst the hum of shifting data and hushed voices. The holo display in front of him projected the stranded fleet. Hundreds of warships, each a fortress of destruction, now reduced to adrift relics. The Council's pride, its symbol of dominance, had been neutered before it could even strike. It was a triumph without carnage. A battle won without bloodshed. And yet,
Something gnawed at Corvin's mind.
Dr. Arya Knox, her gaze fixed on the same holo-display, broke the stillness. "They're trapped," she said, though the words carried no satisfaction. "But we can't assume they're beaten." Corvin turned slightly, considering her statement. She wasn't wrong. A fleet may be stranded, but an empire never surrendered so easily. "They're still alive," he murmured. "And a stranded army is still an army." Across the room, Commander Dallin Voss exhaled sharply. An army without power, without weapons, without a way home. His voice was edged with something between relief and disbelief. "They're nothing but ghosts now." Corvin frowned. Ghosts didn't make war, but they haunted those who had wronged them. And the Galactic Council was not accustomed to powerlessness. The thought unsettled him. He had spent years preparing for invasion, for orbital bombardment, for Earth's desperate last stand. Instead, the war had ended before it began. The weapon humanity had unleashed, the quantum disruptor array, had worked flawlessly, perhaps too flawlessly. No struggle, no sacrifice, just absolute paralysis. And that was what troubled him most. "What's the latest on their transmissions?" he asked. Voss checked his console. Still broadcasting on every frequency, though the tone has changed. No more demands. More desperation. Arya arched an eyebrow. Desperation. Voss hesitated. Requests for parley. Pleas for assistance. He shifted uncomfortably. And some from non-military sources. That caught Corvin's attention. He moved to his own terminal, scanning the intercepted messages. There were the expected threats from high-ranking officers, council admirals barking orders to forces that would never arrive, political figures demanding surrender, arrogant voices clinging to a reality that no longer existed. But beneath them, woven into the chaos, were voices not meant for war. Medical distress signals, civilian frequencies, requests for supplies, for information, for mercy. The war machine of the council was ruthlessly efficient, but not entirely void of weakness. Military fleets often carried ambassadors, researchers, even the families of high-ranking officers, symbols of power, reminders that war was as much about status as strength. And now, those same symbols were stranded in the void, just as helpless as the soldiers meant to protect them. Voss cleared his throat. "Sir, if we respond—" "We don't," Corvin interrupted. "Not yet." He felt the air in the room shift, the quiet tension thickening. Some would see it as cruelty, others as strategy. Corvin knew it was both. Arya's arms folded across her chest. "So what's the plan?" "We wait until they start dying." Her tone carried no accusation, only the blunt edge of reality. Corvin met her gaze. He could see the calculation in her expression, the same unsettling knowledge sitting at the edge of his own thoughts. If they waited too long, the council might choose to die rather than negotiate. And if they intervened too soon, they might turn a tactical victory into a long, slow disaster. "We wait," he said, "until we know what we're dealing with." For the first time in its long, arrogant history, the Galactic Council had been brought to its knees. And that would not go unanswered. The moment they regained their footing, they would strike back with force beyond imagination. Humanity had won this battle. Now they had to survive the war. Far above Earth, aboard the Vigilance, Grand Marshal Ithos Vel sat in suffocating darkness. The emergency lighting cast long, flickering shadows against the walls, pulsating like the last dying heartbeats of a fallen beast. The once proud bridge of his flagship felt like a coffin, and he, its prisoner. The silence was unbearable. Not the quiet of discipline or strategy, but the silence of absolute failure. Every console, every weapon system, every escape protocol, dead. His fleet had been suffocated at the source, its power severed by forces he barely understood. He had seen wars turn, campaigns collapse, but never had he been left utterly powerless. The weight of it pressed against him like a great cosmic joke. His claws flexed against the armrest of his chair, the only movement in a room filled with officers too afraid to speak. They watched him, waiting, unwilling to voice the question burning behind their eyes. What now? Vel's mandibles clicked together as he rose. His movements were slow, deliberate, an iron mask forged to hide the rage boiling beneath his skin. "They expect us to sit and rot," he said at last, voice low and sharp as a blade.
His second-in-command, Commander Ithar, stiffened.
They have disabled every critical system. Even escape pods are inoperative. We are trapped, Grand Marshal.
Vel turned toward the viewport.
Beyond the glass, Earth loomed like a taunt, its surface untouched, its cities aglow, its people unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. For the first time, he understood why the Council had feared them. Not because of their weapons. Not because of their fleets. Because they had done this. They had changed the nature of war itself. He exhaled sharply, turning back to his officers. Then we make them regret it. Ithar hesitated. Sir. Vel's mandibles twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Every war has its rules, Ithar. But rules only matter to those who obey them. The humans had spared them. Disabled them. Left them drifting, helpless. It was a mistake. Because desperation was the most dangerous weapon of all. And they were far from finished. On Earth, Corvin stood alone in the command center, watching the silent graveyard of ships above. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't over. The Council had survived for thousands of years. It had crushed entire civilizations, erased rebellious species from history. They would not accept this outcome. His jaw tightened as he turned to the main console. Monitor all ship activity. Any fluctuations, no matter how small, I want to know.
Voss nodded.
No sarcasm, no doubt. Just grim acknowledgement. Arya leaned against the console, arms folded. You think they'll try something? Corvin exhaled, his gaze still locked on the void above. He didn't think. He knew. And when they did, they would not make the same mistake twice. The war was not over. Admiral Elias Corvin knew it the way a seasoned soldier recognized an ambush before the first shot was fired. Victory, especially one so clean, so absolute, never came without consequence. The Galactic Council's fleet remained powerless, stranded in the cold expanse above Earth. But powerlessness did not mean surrender.
A wounded predator did not lie down and accept its fate. It waited. It watched. And when the moment was right, it struck back with a vengeance.
Corvin stood in the heart of the command center, eyes locked on the holo display that mapped every disabled Council vessel.
His mind was already 6 moves ahead, but a disquieting certainty gnawed at him. He was missing something. Behind him, Dr. Arya Nox's voice broke through his thoughts. Energy fluctuations. He turned. Where? She gestured to the display. One of the ships. Vigilance. The Council's flagship. The thought sent a slow, cold ripple through him. Define fluctuations, Corvin said, stepping closer. Arya's fingers danced across the controls, isolating the anomaly. Minimal. Almost background noise. But the pattern is deliberate. A signal. She nodded. Possibly encrypted. Not on any standard communication band. But they're trying something. Corvin exhaled. That didn't take long. Commander Dallin Voss leaned in, his usual smirk absent.
They're supposed to be dead in the water. They are, Corvin said. For now. Voss studied the display, lips pressed into a thin line. You think they have a backup plan? Corvin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the blinking pulse of energy, a whisper of defiance from a fleet that should have been silent forever. Yes, he said finally. And I think we're about to find out what it is. The question was how much time they had left before it unfolded. Grand Marshal Ithos Vel did not believe in miracles. Victory came through strategy, strength, and the brutal execution of both. And yet, as he stood aboard his disabled flagship, watching his ship's power flicker in weak defiance, he knew that survival now required something else. Patience, calculation, and the willingness to abandon rules. The humans had left them adrift, but not dead. A mistake. Commander Ithar moved beside him, his expression carefully neutral. Signal is broadcasting, Grand Marshal. Vel inclined his head, his mandibles twitching in approval. And the response? None. They see it. Ithar nodded. Undoubtedly. Vel turned toward the viewport. Earth loomed below, so maddeningly close, yet impossibly out of reach. A planet that had done what no empire had managed before, brought the Council's war machine to its knees. But it was not war that had won them this battle. It was technology. A singular, devastating advancement that had rendered an armada useless in an instant. Vel's claws tapped against the armrest of his chair. The humans had evolved faster than anyone predicted. The question was whether they had the wisdom to understand what they had unleashed, or the foresight to realize that the Council's surrender was an illusion. Ithar hesitated. "Sir, even if the signal is received, it may take." "They will answer," Vel interrupted. And they did. A new signal, faint but unmistakable, flickered across the screen. A relay point. A response from outside the system. Vel's mandibles parted slightly. The message was brief. 4 words. Reinforcements en route. Hold. Vel turned away from the display. A slow exhale. A surge of quiet triumph beneath his carefully composed exterior. The war was not over. It was only beginning. On Earth, Corvin stared at the data, feeling something shift beneath his feet. Not physically, but strategically, a silent recognition that the moment of control was slipping. "Someone answered them," Arya said. Voss cursed. "How fast?" Arya's calculations ran in the background. Numbers cascading. "Depends on the fleet. If they were already mobilized..." Her gaze darkened. "Days. Maybe less." Corvin's hands curled into fists. Made sense. The Council would never send a fleet alone, no matter how confident they were. There had to be another force waiting in the dark, beyond the range of Earth's scanners. And now they were coming. Voss exhaled sharply. "Do we have a countermeasure?" The words hung in the air, a lead weight no one wanted to acknowledge. The quantum disruptor array had been humanity's single advantage, but it was experimental, volatile. They had never tested it twice. Arya seemed to read Corvin's thoughts. "We don't know if it will hold." "And if it doesn't?" Voss asked. A long silence. Then Corvin spoke. "Then we do what humans do best." Arya arched a brow. "Which is?" "We adapt." Vel knew the humans had intercepted the message. That was the point. The first battle had been lost, but war was never decided by a single moment. The humans believed they had broken the Council's power, but all they had done was force it to evolve. There were no rules now. No treaties. No restraint. The Council had underestimated one thing about humanity. They had expected them to fight like an empire. They had expected tactics. Logistics. Standard military doctrine. They had not expected the unexpected. Vel would not make the same mistake. The humans had shown their greatest weapon. Now, it was time to show them what true war looked like. And this time, there would be no survivors. The war had entered its second phase, but this was no longer a battle of weapons or fleets. It was a contest of who could outthink the other before everything collapsed. Admiral Elias Corvin stood at the heart of Earth's command center, his face illuminated by the cold glow of the holo display. The data told a story he didn't want to believe. The reinforcements were coming. They were fast. And they were inevitable. On the main screen, the projected fleet movement pulsed in slow, predatory waves, like a beast closing in on its wounded prey. There was no time for another disruptor strike, no way to retreat, and nowhere to hide. Commander Dallin Voss let out a sharp breath beside him. "We need a miracle." Dr. Arya Knox barely looked up from her terminal. "Miracles aren't real." Her fingers moved rapidly across the interface. "But physics is." Corvin exhaled, watching her. "Tell me you have something." "I have a theory," she said, eyes dark with exhaustion but still alight with the sharp edge of intellect. "And theories are where the good stuff starts." She turned, fingers pulling up the three-dimensional simulation of the Sol system. "The first disruptor strike worked because we targeted the transition point, that precise moment when the Council's fleet exited hypertravel. If we hit them at that exact moment again..." Voss cut in, shaking his head. "We don't have another shot. The array wasn't built for multiple uses. The energy grid barely survived the first blast." Arya didn't argue. "Which is why I'm suggesting a different approach." She zoomed in on the approaching fleet's trajectory, highlighting the gravitational fields around Jupiter. "We can't stop them from arriving," she said. "But we might be able to stop where they arrive." Corvin frowned. "Explain." "They're coming in on a stable insertion route, Minimal drift, no gravitational hazards. Her voice turned grim. But if we alter that stability, just slightly, when they exit hypertravel, they won't land where they expect. Voss's expression darkened. And where would they land? Arya tapped a single point on the display. Jupiter's gravity well. A heavy silence filled the room. You want to pull them into Jupiter's atmosphere, Corvin said slowly. Arya nodded. Just a fraction of a course deviation. If we time it right, their ships won't emerge into open space. They'll emerge into a death spiral. Voss let out a low whistle. That's horrifying. Corvin's mind raced through the logistics. Could work. The gravitational shift would need to be imperceptible. An anomaly so minor that their navigational systems wouldn't detect it in time. Too much interference, and they might compensate. Too little, and it wouldn't matter. It's possible, Arya said. Difficult, but possible. Corvin exhaled. They had no other choice. Get to work, he ordered. Grand Marshal Ithos Vel had expected fear. He had expected panic, regret, desperation. He had prepared for humanity's feeble attempts to negotiate. Instead, as the sensors of the vigilance flickered back to life, as the incoming reinforcements crossed into range, he felt something else entirely. Control. The humans had played their hand, believing they had broken the Council's will. They had bathed in the illusion of victory. Now, it was time to rip that illusion apart. They will try to stop the reinforcements, Vel said, his voice as cold as the void. He watched Earth shrink below them, its surface untouched, its people oblivious to the storm that loomed. Commander Ithar stood beside him, unreadable. They will try to outthink us. Vel's mandibles twitched in something almost amused. Intelligence is not the same as wisdom, Ithar continued carefully. Vel inclined his head slightly. No, it is not. He turned to his officers. Prepare the countermeasure. Ithar hesitated, then spoke carefully. Sir, if we activate it now. I know, Vel interrupted. Do it anyway. The war would end the way it should have begun. Without mercy. The moment of impact came like a slow-motion catastrophe. On Earth, Aria's calculations were perfect. The gravitational shift was minor, almost imperceptible to standard sensors. The approaching fleet never detected it, just a fraction of a degree off course. But in the delicate mathematics of interstellar navigation, a fraction of a degree was fatal. Then something went wrong. A pulse of energy erupted from the disabled Council fleet, rippling outward like a detonation with no explosion. Every console in the command center blazed red. What the hell was that? Voss shouted. Aria's fingers blurred across her console. Her breath caught. It's... She stopped. Stared. Corvin's stomach tightened. Nox. What is it? Her voice came out quiet. They just moved. The dead fleet. The lifeless husks floating in orbit. The ships that should have been crippled beyond repair. They moved. Corvin snapped his gaze to the holo display. One by one, the warships were shifting position. Not under power, not firing, but adjusting just enough to disrupt the gravitational distortion they had created. Not enough to stop it entirely. Just enough to change its target. His blood ran cold. They're redirecting it, Arya whispered. Voss's voice was hoarse. Redirecting it where? Arya turned. Met Corvin's gaze. No one spoke the answer. They all knew. The anomaly was now centered on Earth. Vel watched the shift occur, his breathing steady. It was almost beautiful. The humans had believed the Council's fleet was dead. That powerlessness meant surrender. It never had. The ships had never needed engines to be weapons. They were the weapons. And now, with the gravitational distortion collapsing inward, they had become a planetary bombardment waiting to happen. One by one, the ships began their slow, inevitable descent. Vel exhaled. Let's see how they survive this. Corvin had never felt helpless before. Not like this. The entire Council fleet was coming down like a rain of stone and fire. The quantum disruptor had turned them into wreckage, but now those wrecks were falling straight toward the only home humanity had left. The numbers flashed in real time. Impact velocity. Atmospheric breach points. Estimated devastation zones. there would be no survivors.
Voss's voice was distant.
Orders.
Arya's hands clenched into fists. Corvin's mind worked through the options, discarding them as fast as they appeared.
No weapons capable of deflecting that much mass. No ships fast enough to intercept. No time. Unless. His head snapped up. We need to fire the disruptor again. Arya's eyes widened. It'll overload the system. I know. She hesitated. If we push it past safety limits, we might. I know, Corvin repeated, sharper this time. She searched his face. Then nodded. We might have one shot left. Corvin turned to his crew. Then make it count. There was no other choice.
Above, the sky began to burn.
The sky burned.
From the ground, the wreckage of the Galactic Council's fleet descended in slow, fiery arcs. Massive husks of metal, once the mightiest warships in the galaxy, had become a cataclysm hurtling toward Earth. 1,000 falling stars, each capable of annihilating entire cities. In the command center, Admiral Elias Corvin stood motionless, watching the projections flicker across the holo-display. There was no time left. The quantum disruptor had one final shot before the system collapsed under its own strain. Firing now means permanent overload, Dr. Arya Nox said, her voice tight. If we push past safety limits, we might never restore it. If we don't fire, Corvin said, eyes still locked on the screen, we won't need it again.
A long silence. Then Arya turned back to her console. Charging sequence initiated. Commander Dallin Voss exhaled sharply. If we survive this, I'm retiring. Corvin glanced at him. You don't believe that? No, Voss admitted. But it's a nice thought. The overhead lights dimmed as power diverted to the disruptor array. Consoles flickered. A low, ominous hum reverberated through the command center as the weapons capacitors strained. Arya's hands flew over the controls. 50% charge. On the main display, the lead wreckage, a council dreadnought the size of a small city, broke through the upper atmosphere. Friction ignited its surface, sending molten debris raining ahead of it. One impact alone could wipe out millions. 70%, Arya called. Corvin clenched his fists. Faster. A tremor rippled through the station. The generators groaned under the demand. Disruptor at 90%. Fire, Corvin ordered. Arya hit the command. A pulse of energy, too bright to be seen directly, ripped through the sky. The shockwave sent tremors through the Earth's upper atmosphere, distorting reality itself as it reached the falling wreckage. For a second, nothing happened. Then the fleet fractured. The energy pulse tore through the Council's remains, unraveling metal and matter alike. The largest ships disintegrated, their structures unable to withstand the raw force. Fragments that had once been warships splintered, redirected into safer trajectories, toward the ocean, toward uninhabited deserts, toward places that could survive the impact. The holo-display updated in real time. The death toll projections dropped. The worst had been avoided. Arya let out a breath. Voss muttered something that might have been a prayer. Corvin simply watched. The sky still burned, but Earth would live. Far above, aboard the Vigilance, Grand Marshal Ithos Vel saw his last play collapse. The human weapon had not just destroyed the falling fleet, it had denied him his final victory. Vel's claws dug into the armrest of his chair. He had underestimated them. They should not have been capable of this, he said quietly. Commander Ithar, standing beside him, did not respond. There was nothing left to say. Vel turned to his remaining officers. Prepare the escape protocols. Ithar hesitated. Sir, we are not dying here, Vel said. His mandibles clicked as he exhaled slowly. Not today. The Vigilance's emergency thrusters still functioned. Unlike the rest of the fleet, they had power. They could flee. And they would. But this war was not over. Vel would return. But he would not make the same mistake twice. Corvin stood outside the command center, looking up at the sky. The fires were dying down, the last of the wreckage falling into the ocean, the deserts, the frozen wastelands. It would take years to recover, to repair what had been broken, but Earth was still here. Arya walked up beside him. It's over. Corvin shook his head. No.
She didn't argue.
Because they both knew the truth. This was only the first war. The Council would return. Maybe not today, maybe not for years. But they would.
And when they did, they would not underestimate humanity again.
But neither would humanity underestimate them. For the first time in history, the balance had shifted. The Council was no longer the sole power in the galaxy. Earth had proven something no one had thought possible. They had not just survived. They had won. And when the next war came, humanity would be ready.